Welcome to our latest Book Reporter Talks to interview, where I'm thrilled to have Liz Moore here with me today, and we're going to be talking about Long Bright River. This is going to be my first Book Reporter Bets On selection of 2020, the first of a new decade, and I'm super excited about that. Long Bright River looks at the opioid crisis and its ripple effects across a family, told through the story of two sisters. So welcome, Liz. So nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Love having you here. Let's start with setting. Your book is set in Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood. And I knew of this area because there was an article that ran in May 2017 about the librarians at, I think it was the Pioneer Square Library there.
McPherson Square,
McPherson Square Library there. And they had been dealing with the opioid crisis on the lawn of their library. Mm-hmm. And they were running out with Narcan and just being there as resuscitators, bringing life-saving equipment out to people. And I found that was so interesting that they would have that kind of a role. Mm-hmm. And so I was familiar with the area when I first started, picking up the book. But what was inspired for you to be writing about Kensington? And I think you've done some community work there.
I had, yeah. I loved that article too. The Philadelphia Inquirer has done a really remarkable job of covering Kensington and its opioid crisis, but also other parts of the neighborhood, and the way in which the neighborhood is, like locals to the neighborhood, longtime residents of the neighborhood are really kind of coming together to support the neighborhood in various ways. That article, I began this book, the seeds of this book were really back in 2009.
Wow.
When I went up to Kensington with a friend of mine who's a photographer who was making portraits of the neighborhood. His name's Jeff Stockbridge, and he has been working in that neighborhood continuously since then, basically. And he knew I was a writer, so he invited me up to come up and interview his subjects and just sort of get their stories. And I was very moved by a lot of what I heard. Mm-hmm. And I began sort of keeping a diary or like almost like nonfiction sketches of our days there. I only went up with Jeff a handful of times, but after that, I started going up on my own. I continued to write about the neighborhood, and I started doing community work at an organization called St. Francis Inn, which is a wonderful organization that supports Kensington in a variety of ways. So I taught free writing workshops at a women's day shelter there. And all of those experiences combined to sort of create the inspiration for the novel, mm-hmm. along with, like many people in the States, my own family has a long history of addiction, mm-hmm. which is, that's sort of like where I stopped talking about it, but
mm-hmm.
There's that kind of autobiographical spark as well. Mm-hmm. And so those are the main two sources of inspiration for the novel.
Yeah, and I think that every family realizes that these days, that there's some place somewhere in their history, somewhere along the way, addiction has reared its head.
Absolutely,
and I think that what you bring to life in this book is what happens to families, what happens to people as a result. I love the way the book was structured with then and now. So you're constantly hearing the background of these two sisters, of what got them to this point. So instead of just reading about with them now, was that always the structure that you planned to go forth with?
When I set out to write Long Bright River, I didn't know that it would be a suspense novel or crime fiction mm-hmm. or literary suspense or whatever people are calling, whatever term you want to use.
Thriller or whatever it is, right.
This is actually my fourth book, mm-hmm. And all of my other books have been sort of quieter family dramas. Mm-hmm. And that my initial conception for this book was that it would also be kind of a quieter family drama. So the start of the book, the first scenes that I wrote within the book centered on the sisters' childhood, because one of the most important threads of the book to me is it's kind of a love story between two sisters, mm-hmm. and it's they were so bonded as children by what they endured that when one goes missing in the present of the novel, even though they haven't spoken in a while, the other one feels absolutely compelled to search for her. So much of the early writing of the book centered on their past, because mm-hmm. I needed to get a good sense of who they were then. And then most of that writing actually didn't make it into the final draft of the book. The then sections are quite condensed compared to what they once were. But all that writing did kind of give me a good sense of who these characters were in a way that I think animated them in their present too, I hope.
Completely, because I thought the backstory was so sad, but you also saw them as children who had these bright moments. They had these bright moments of joy together.
Yeah.
But by the same token, there was so much fractured in their lives that they were actually had to be there for each other because nobody else was. And it came through very, very strongly, even though it's, pared down to what you had before. You have the essence that is so strong in your storytelling. And I, completely walked around with this. We talked about a lot of children with lost childhoods due to addiction. Was that something you saw a lot in your community work? Like a lot of people that were in these situations, their lost childhoods happened because of addicts as well?
Yeah, addiction is quite cyclical. I'm not saying anything most people don't know, but certainly a lot of the people that I've met in Kensington and otherwise were the children of people with addiction and themselves were suffering from addiction and often had children who were, in some cases, too young to have used any substances, but in other cases were already starting to do so. And then you would see the opposite where, there would be the first generation of a family to completely break the cycle of addiction and to rebel and say, I will never touch anything. I won't even take a drink. I've met people like that as well. And they were kind of my inspiration for Mickey, who is the protagonist of the book and quite, she's a real straight arrow, almost to a fault. Like she has a concept of herself that is problematic because she always believes she's on the right side of the law. And then, of course, we come to find out that in many ways she's not.
She's not, and she does some pushback that we're going to get into a little bit later on. Of she goes to a different kind of a personality, a different side of her personality. When I was reading it, I was thinking about her a lot in the character of Sarah Smarsh's Heartland.
That I've heard so many people recommend that book to me. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, and Sarah Smarsh very much broke the cycle in her family of what was going on, and she just realized that she couldn't drink. There were certain things she couldn't do, or she would be her parents. That's the same thing, would happen going on. The title, Long Bright River, has some real significance, and if you could just talk to us about that, because when I read it, I was like, dead on perfect of what's going on,
The title came very late. In fact, I had a complete draft of the book without a title, or with a bad title that I always knew was bad. And so before we submitted the book for publication, I sort of confined myself to a room for a full work day and just looked through every text I could find, poems, songs, passages of prose that dealt in any way with addiction. And in doing so, I came across a Tennyson poem called The Lotus Eaters, which the story of a group of sailors who are addicted to opium. And it contained the phrase Long Bright River, which immediately leapt off the page to me because in my mind I saw all these other associations with that phrase. And then I ended up sort of inserting that phrase in various ways throughout the book, one of which is in reference to a vein.
That's the one that really struck with me.
Yeah.
Because it's like there's the long bright river of what's going to, it's a long bright river of joy that's coming into somebody just by injecting and what they were doing.
Yeah. And then there's the Delaware River and also this idea of a river of names of departed people who've been lost to addiction. And
it leads me right into the book opens with 52 names. And when I was first looking at the 52 names, a lot of times authors will open with acknowledgments. Yeah. And I sat there and I was like, wait a second, are these the people that she's acknowledging? What is it? And it was a list. And in reading, I realized it was not acknowledgments. It was all the people that had impacted Mickey's life and Mickey and her sister's life as a result. And it was just the way the addiction was so rampant. It was a friend. It was the mother, the father. And just reading that was right in your face right at the beginning. And was that always something you wanted to start with, or somewhere along the way to say, this is a powerful way to get people right in?
I went back and forth on the opening quite a bit. The list, I think, if I'm remembering right, originally only appeared once at the end of the book. But I didn't love that. So the way that the book opens now is there's this list, and then the next chapter begins, there's a body on the Gurney Street tracks. I didn't like that as the opening to this novel because it felt too crimey. It felt like, all right, this is going to be nothing but a police procedural, and this is how, it's almost a cliche to open a police procedural with a body. That's so many books do that, and I thought I want this book to kind of raise other questions as well. And so I decided, with the help of my editor, to open in a different way, in a kind of a more surprising way. I think.
Yeah, and when I sat there and I looked, it was the range of people, the way the range of people had been that, had touched her, and you were just looking, going, wow, this is a lot of people that have had an impact on this person's life. And I think that set it up. And I agree with you. If we'd just gone to the body at the beginning, it would have been, oh, it's an overdose, it's this or that. It would have been almost a cliche opener, whereas this was like, I just thought much more powerful. Your dialogue is set off with these dashes instead of quote marks. And what was that? What was that about?
It's funny you ask. I never realized how many people have strong opinions about that until I published
I'm fine
a book.
with it, just so you know. I'm fine with it.
A lot. I mean, this is the day of publication, so I haven't had events yet with official events, but online you start to see people saying, "Well, I just really had trouble with the dialogue and all this stuff." I think for me, Mickey, the narrator, it's written in the first person present. She is very. I think of her spoken voice as very subdued and understated and sort of monotone. She's very self-possessed. Oh, that's the wrong word. Self-contained. She's shy. She describes herself as shy. And to me, when I started with quotation marks, and it just felt like this big announcement anytime she spoke or a different character spoke. And so I liked the quieter visual of the dash to start a line of dialogue and to sort of let the dialogue fade from there, so that it didn't feel, it almost felt like Mickey kind of like mumbling her story in a way that reminded me of the way she might speak.
And I liked it too because sometimes, well, if you're using quote marks, you then need to say brusquely, or you need to throw adjectives in there. You need to do things. And sometimes when you're just getting to the point, it's just what the reader needs. It's just the dialogue, what's going on. I remember when Daisy Jones and the Six came out last year, and it was just these people's spoken dialogue.
Yeah.
And it was great because when you're listening on audio, you don't just say, he said, she said, this, that. And I felt like I was much more in the story because that wasn't what was going back and forth. And you could definitely figure out, I was never lost, let's put it that way.
Good.
And I felt like,
Yeah.
oh, this is, it's very, very smooth. And I didn't notice it on first reading.
Yeah.
I went back because I had read this much earlier. And I went back last night and I was reading, and the night before, and I was like, wait a second, this is like this really cool thing that I remember when I first read it.
Yeah.
I was like, I like that, you
That's
know?
cool. Yeah.
Because you don't have to sit there and, describe too much first. So who came first, Mickey or Casey? Mickey is the sister who's the police officer, and Casey is the sister who's the addict who's lost on the street. Was one came first?
Casey came first. I always had a visual sort of who she was and what she looked like. And I should say up front, she is based on no one person. And in fact, the visual I have of her, I don't know even anyone who looks like that. But I was having a difficult time writing her voice authentically. I started with experimenting with different first-person voices. And I mean, I do think that it is possible to write one's way into a lot of different characters, but I think it helps if you have certain things in common with that character. And so for me, a way to write about Casey was to write a character I had more in common with and offer her perspective of her sister. And so I, in a lot of different ways, I have more in common with Mickey. And so I kind of created Mickey as a foil for Casey, because you also always need conflict. So I thought, like, who is the most opposite character I can come up with to Casey? And it was a completely by the book police officer who was very assured of her moral uprightness and everything,
right,
like that.
Yeah,
so.
It was like, this is who the complete antithesis would be of who the Casey character is. And it's almost like if we opened with the Casey character on the page so much, it would not have been cliche, but it would have been what you expected. And now you're seeing this other very different person dealing with her sister, and it immediately changes your head on what's going on because you're seeing it from a different perspective. I think that a lot of times when we're thinking about the addict personality, you know exactly what scenarios you're going to think of: lying in the gutter, shooting up, this, that. Whereas we didn't start with that. We started with, there's a body, but we don't know really what happened to this person, and it's not her sister.
Yeah.
So, drugs are such a force in Mickey's world. She thrived in a world that was so dark, and she pulled herself out of this. Writing her in the first person gives the readers, I felt, a chance to crawl inside her head. And I really like that idea. Was it always the first person for Mickey's character?
It was, yeah. It was, is that true? Oh, gosh, I've been writing this book for so long. I think I do have third-person sketches of this book about these characters, now that I think of it. But the book really only took strong shape when Mickey's first-person voice emerged. Yeah.
Because Mickey's like anchoring the book.
Yeah.
It's like Mickey's got this, and you go through her self-doubt, you go through her disappointment, you go through so many emotions with her that I felt like if it wasn't in the first person, we were in her head, it wouldn't have been quite the same book.
Yeah.
There were so many, there was a lot of really good decisions made as time was going on with the book. The subject of addiction and what it does not just to addicts, to all around them, was something I was riveted to. Like, what drives somebody to become an addict, and how does it entrap them? And I was looking at it through different eyes when I saw it through the police department. Like when I saw there, what was going on with them, and also the police corruption that was then surrounded going on the streets. Because you just saw victims for so long, but then you realize these victims were victims in a different way as well.
Yeah.
And as a result, became this different story. Layering in the police just gave it a different kind of vibe, because you just weren't with these two people, and one of them is part of the force, but she's also seeing what's really going on out there. Yeah. Was that, like, we're talking about the police part of the story?
Sure.
Because that's like Law and Order.
Yeah. So one of the things that I heard over and over again when speaking with women in Kensington is that many of them have been victims of sexual assault by police. That's a very common thing that is spoken of aloud, but never kind of written down. And in researching the book, I kind of started doing investigating as much as I could to see if there was any record of this, and I could find nothing, which meant either this was a fabrication, which didn't feel right to me, because it reverberated a lot, and the story was often the same between like completely separate people, or the police were just doing a very good job of kind of covering that up. What is interesting is that after the book was completely written, in fact, just a few months ago, again, the Philadelphia Inquirer, which does really good work, published recently. I think they gained access to internal police records for the first time that revealed some instances of police officers doing exactly what the women had been telling me about for all those years.
Wow.
There's one that is an almost exact kind of replication of what I had heard, and that was published in the Inquirer. And there's another that's similar, and there are several in other locations. But it felt validating, I guess, and I'm glad that some of that is coming to light. I should say also, in the interest of fairness, I went for a ride along.
I was going to ask if you did that. Yeah.
And the police officer I was assigned to, who was a community relations officer, was very kind and helpful, and showed me all around the neighborhood, and talked to me a lot about what happens in a typical day for police officers. Who I can imagine that it's quite difficult to patrol a neighborhood like Kensington. And he was very gracious, but I was also aware that he was a community relations officer whose job it was to be gracious. Right? So it's a very complicated, multifaceted
It's what you see on the street
situation,
and what is really going on the street. Right. One of the things I was thinking about is often addiction for women is comorbid with the sex trade, and that's not happening with men. Quite well, it has some, but it's really, you see women as the victims. Women are the victims that we've been talking about more. Let's put it that way through the years. But it's men and women. But do you think that there's a difference between how a woman handles addiction compared to men from what you've seen through the years, or is it the same?
I certainly don't know the statistics on sex work and sex and gender and addiction. And anecdotally, there's a lot of, the main similarity that I saw in people's stories was the vast majority of people that I met in Kensington either had been prescribed pills or as young people took pills from a family member, got hooked on those pills, which evolved into a need for something less expensive than pills, which evolved to for snorting heroin and then injecting heroin, and then seeking stronger and stronger heroin, including sometimes fentanyl. So it's like that's the pattern, and that seems to happen with both men and women. And yeah, I'm not sure I could answer that in a smarter way.
Well, if when you're sitting looking at women, do the women see themselves more as the victims than men saw themselves as victims, or did everybody see themselves as victims of being addicted?
I think it varies by the person. I think there are some people who recognize that there are bigger societal forces at play and big organizations, pharmaceutical companies that are a part of the story of how individuals became addicted. And then there are other people who are very self-blaming and who assign a lot of responsibility to themselves for their own addiction. And I don't know what the truth is. I think everybody has a different take on that. And I didn't notice a difference in gender or sex.
And gender and sex than
yeah.
that. I remember in the 60s and 70s, heroin was like a big drug, and people were dying. And then we went for a time where nothing was happening.
Yeah.
And then after big pharma, it's picked up again.
Yes.
And it's like, there are billboards that run now and say, if your child gets their wisdom teeth out, do you realize where that could lead?
Yeah.
And it's really true because you see these, so many documentaries I've watched, so much that the reading that I've done has been, it starts with something very, very tiny. And then from there, that feel-good feeling has to be generated again and again. And I just don't think that it's, it's something that people think about. And I think that they hear on an intellectual level, but until you've lived on the streets and actually seen the ramifications going on, we don't realize how big it is. And that's the reason I think this is an important book, because it's bringing that to light. Because there have been books about addiction, but this is really, there's this town, and this is, you're really feeling what was happening in this place. So when you were with the police, when you were doing your ride by, and granted you were with the community service person, giving your good spiel or whatever, did you feel that there were things you couldn't write about? Did you feel that or did you feel that this is fiction? I have pretty much free reign.
The only thing I felt I couldn't write about was anybody's specific story that I had heard, and I didn't. So all of the, anecdotes in this book are made up. All the circumstances of these characters are made up. They might coincidentally have something in common with a real person just because there's only so many versions of that story, but yeah, I felt protective of people's individual stories, and I certainly wouldn't have written them. But no, I felt I am a little apprehensive about the way that it will be received by certain people or certain groups. But I didn't stop myself from writing it or writing about them.
Well, and I thought it was interesting too, because you have a female police officer.
Right.
So there are men that are doing things on the force that are different. There are things that she's hearing about. There are things that she's seeing. But you have a woman. And I think that there brings a certain different attitude to that, because it's a nurturing spirit. She's got a child. She is looking for her sister. And I just saw that, being a woman, and this sounds terribly sexist. It really sounds horrible, but I felt that, how is she looking at this differently than a guy that was on the job? Quite the same way, because she's also looking for her sister, and it's her sister who's lost. And I felt that that was the reason that you could draw her as a different kind of a police officer character, because you had that humanity of her, because she was looking for someone she knew. It wasn't just, oh, this is somebody on the case, blah, blah, blah. It's somebody I know that's out there. And that's my, what's informing my decisions about what's happening on the street, is it's not anonymous people. And I felt that made it stronger, whether she was a female police officer or not. It's just because it was a relative.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah, I think she is certainly, she's kind of lonely, and she doesn't have that many connections. And her sister was a very important connection in her youth. And so she feels compelled to go find her.
Go find her and go. It's officers knew many of the people by name on the street. They knew the women by name. They knew, hey, Paul, how you doing? Hey, so-and-so. And it reminded me, years ago, I worked at Condé Nast when they were on Madison Avenue, and I'd walk to Port Authority every night. And you walk down 41st Street only till a certain hour, and only if there were a lot of people. But the same people were on the street every night. And you'd hear people call out their names, you know who they were, and you knew they were homeless. You knew they were probably in some form of drug addiction or alcoholism or something like that. And I remember that it was really like the times of The Deuce on HBO. Like it was just as nutty and crazy at those times. And I walked down and I remember there was a set of twins, and you could tell that they were sisters. You could, see what was going on. And one of them at one point broke her foot. And we would watch, and I realized she was going to be in the cast for 6 weeks, and I walked past these people every night. They were a part of my going home, but they were anonymous to me. But you realize that there were people in the neighborhood who knew these people, and then you'd see them disappear, and then she'd be back, and things like that. So it was this undercurrent that was happening while all these people were racing home, but these people's lives were happening in this parallel to ours. And it was such a powerful thing that when I was reading this and I was realizing police officers on the street, they're talking about these people by name. I actually remember this one woman's name at one point. I don't remember it now. And yet you were relating to them as people, but you were on two different planes. You were like traveling in parallel universes at the same time. And I just felt like when you had them speaking to them by name on the street and whatever, you realize you recognize them as people, but they're people that are sort of running in a different sphere of life than what you're doing.
Yeah, that's astute. Yeah, there's definitely, I think it's easy to go through your day intentionally focusing anywhere but on people who are in need of help all around you.
Or even just people that are around you. They're just people. A couple of years ago when we first moved into this office, we heard the saxophone playing. And I thought there was, because we were new to the building, I thought there was a music place like inside the city. And then I was at the window one day and I saw the guy playing the saxophone, and it was around the holidays. And I walked down, and it wasn't a homeless person. It was, somebody was, but I just said, I just want you to know that you meant something to my day of hearing these songs. And I felt like there was this connection thing with this person who was really anonymous. He was just out there. I'm sure there were tons of people, and I'm not saying there was anything special about my running downstairs, but it was that connection thing that you felt like you had. Because a lot of times you go in to get coffee from the same person, you have no idea what their name is. Yeah. And the same kind of thing is happening, but it's on the street. And I think it makes it realize with social media and with whatever stuff is happening today, we're all so still very disconnected from one another. True. And, just bringing that in. Casey spent time in rehab. She, and it does not really end up better for her. And there's a lot of conversation about when you go into rehab, is it really the best thing? Because you're now going to be introduced with people that have other bad habits. And I thought you did a very good job of portraying it doesn't always emerge as something perfect when people walk out.
Yeah, statistics data shows that it takes the average person a number of times, like many times, of getting sober and then relapsing and getting sober and then relapsing before they achieve sobriety for a period of 5 years.
Wow.
And you're right, rehabs, some are better than others. Again, data shows that usually medication-assisted treatment with methadone, for example, has a better outcome long-term than programs that promote sort of true abstinence, meaning like no methadone maintenance. And then within, even in both of those categories, there are government-funded ones, and then there are fancy private ones. And again, I don't know the statistics on which is more effective. You're right that just anecdotally, I've talked to a lot of people who say it takes like getting out of a particular geographic location where where you have your habits and your patterns and your friends, and going someplace brand new, but almost nobody has the resources to do that. So it's very, very challenging.
And I also think it has something to do with age, because I think she was 16 when she first went in, or very young. And as a result, you're not on a path to making great choices. You're still finding yourself and you're still making mistakes. And I felt that, when she went into that situation, it's not like they were the greatest group of people for her to be role modeling from. And I think that becomes more difficult too, because you're so impressionable at her age. And her sister's sitting and watching this whole thing spinning out of control, but she can do nothing to stop it. This is a person you should just share a bed with, tell every story about. And yet she's got other things that are going on with her life with the person who's running the police athletic league. I don't want to give away too much with the book. But she's got her own people that she's turning to, and they're really not there for her either. So these girls are sort of adrift in many different ways.
That's right. Yeah, I think both kids are seeking connections and seeking, I don't know, Mickey's seeking stability and seeking adult role models, some of whom are good and some of whom are bad, as it turns out. And Casey's seeking, like, love. That's what I think of when I think of Casey. And in her case, unfortunately, it comes in the form of, like, narcotics. But narcotics do have the effect of making you feel, like, warm and cozy and loved.
Good about yourself.
Good about yourself.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's what I think 16-year-old Casey found, and that's what drew her to opioid medication and then heroin.
Well, I also think that dignity is something that came through me very strongly as a theme in the book, that especially at the beginning, Mickey's looking for dignity. She's looking for it when she goes to the theater with her class, and she's wearing the pretty dress, but she's got the ugly ski jacket, and the rich kids are there. She's looking for it when she does the birthday party for her son, and the other mother, you know, puts her down. She's constantly seeking dignity. And I feel it's the same thing. It's a very strong theme because it's the same thing that people on the street are looking for, is dignity. And even though where they are right now, they'd like to better themselves. They'd like to be able to hold their heads high. And when there are any moments where they feel that they could be the kingpin of the block or whatever, it matters a lot. So I felt that that was a theme that I didn't see as strongly on first reading as I saw on second reading. And I said,
That's
you know,
smart,
it's just really where, you know, like these people want to be. I just saw it as a very strong theme. There are many dark times in this book that I was wondering after this, did you just run and hug your child and her children?
Yeah, I think all the time about kids who are the children of parents with addiction, or, yeah, it's very, very difficult to think about kids who have been affected by the opioid crisis, or, you know, any kids who are not, like, well parented, or kids whose parents are absent for one reason or another. Yeah, it definitely keeps me up at night.
Well, you know, you're also thinking, though, too, is Mickey is also in a relationship where she's estranged from her husband. She's estranged, and she has a son, and she's trying to give him the best possible life. But she still has to go to work in the morning, and she's got the most unreliable babysitter. Oh my gosh! I think anybody who's a parent who has had an unreliable babysitter so related to, you know, what's going on there. And when you find any kind of stability, that older woman who can help her, anybody who can do this, that not only gives her the dignity but the stability to go on. And I think that's what the people in the street I felt were looking for as well, is that same kind of, what can I just do to get through the day, you know? And I think that it's not looking for long term, it's looking for these short bursts of happiness and joy. So you look at Philly the same way I felt like Dennis Lehane's looking at Boston. And you go right into that, you know, well, Dorchester, of course, now has been, like, you know, rejuvenated. It's like, you know, regentrified and whatever. But you really feel the darkness and the grit of the streets. Do you like writing okay, when you're writing, do you like writing character, dialogue, plot, scene? What's the thing that you enjoy the most? That'll get you right into it first.
All of my books start with, like, I guess character comes first. All my books start with one or two characters who have a problem in a place, and, like, they have to solve that problem. But place is very important too. Whether it's funny you mentioned Dorchester. My last book, The Unseen World, was actually set in Dorchester.
Oh, okay.
And I grew up in a town called Framingham, which is like 30 minutes from Boston, Dorchester. I think both Dorchester and Kensington are interesting to me because, as you say, both are right on the verge of great wealth and still have pockets of great poverty. And that, too, poses a lot of conflicts and a lot of ethical questions. And So those locations to me make very good settings for books. Mm-hmm. I think all my books have been set in places like that, now that I think about it.
And Kensington still has a lot of pride. There's a lot of Kensington pride that even though these people are sort of on the, let's say, they're not on the right side of life in a lot of ways, there's still a pride in being a part of Kensington. And it's like, Kensington proud or whatever, even though it's not like, what we would actually see. You can't picture them wanting to go someplace else. This is their community, even though it is this drug-addled, street-ridden. I mean, the women who are walking the streets together are all part of a community. They're all feeling for each other.
And I should be clear about Kensington because Kensington, I want to do justice to it. It's actually a very cool, there are a lot of long-standing residents of Kensington who are doing very cool cultural projects and community work. It's, I think outsiders, and I am an outsider myself, come in and see articles that have been written about Kensington, my book, which is written about Kensington, most of which I think tend to center on the fact that Kensington is sort of a hotbed of opioid use. But you also meet people who are out there sweeping the block every day, who've lived there for generations, who know everybody, who are doing, their very best to plant flowers, do community work. And Kensington also has this other side to it where, for better or worse, a lot of very kind of artsy young people are moving into Kensington and doing interesting art projects there. Kensington is a very multifaceted
It's a
place.
blended community. It's a blended different things going on. And there may be blocks that are look, when I was walking home, 41st Street was very different from 44th Street.
Right.
It's they're islands of places. When I was growing up, we lived in the suburbs, but there were certain towns that were nearby that life was a lot riskier.
Yeah.
It was you didn't go there at night. But there were other places where you were blocks away from people. There were pockets of places that, and I saw that there because you saw that the people were, this is I'm in my house, but a couple blocks away there's other things going on.
Yeah, there's a cool book called Voices of Kensington that was published probably in the 80s, I want to say. I could be wrong about that, but I used it as a primary source text. It's just interviews of, in their own first-person words, residents of Kensington about their life, their work, their family, and that was a very cool book.
Yeah, very, very telling. Yeah. And also in this book, the grandmother ends up taking on this parental role that she did not sign up for because their mother was an addict who died. So you also have another generation of people where she shouldn't be doing this at this point in her life. Her parenting days should be over. But by the same token, she's drawn into this other role of this is what her role is and what she has to do. Yeah. And I think that for a lot of people, it's not like the straight path of you have a child, you are a child, you grow up, and these lines that it doesn't happen for everybody. Right. It's like the American dream, but it's not what, and I think you do a good job of talking about when the dream fails, when the dream is broken, but how you still want to survive and who you still see the connection with your sibling. So it was selected as a Good Morning America Book Club book, which was pretty exciting the other day. I just love that. As well as the inaugural selection just today in the New York Times for group text. My friend Liz Egan writes that column, and I was so cool. Excited to see.
Tell her thanks.
It's the first book.
That one came out of nowhere, at least to me. Maybe my publishers knew, but that one was so cool to see because I had no heads up about it.
What I really, really loved was what she was talking about is that this is a real book club kind of a book because you're going to be able to get into talking about this dysfunctional family because that's a common theme in many book club books. You're getting to talk about addiction. You're getting to talk about so many different themes that you could bring to the discussion. And that's the reason I really love when she picked it today. We're actually doing something on Reading Group Guys right now where I selected 6 books that I think book clubs should be reading, and this is one of them for the first beginning part of the year. And I said because there's something to discuss, and there are a lot of books where they're great books to read, but a discussion about them. And a book like this, I feel like so many people will be able to sit and talk about with their group because they'll either know somebody or they'll know a circumstance or they'll have learned more and they'll understand more, which I think is important as well.
Yeah.
So
Thanks for choosing it.
yeah, it was, as soon as I read it, I was like, wait, this is a book I want to get into as many hands as, totally possible. So we're talking on the day your book comes out. You've got an extensive tour ahead of you, and you're also going to the UK, which I think is going to be, incredibly fun. Are you going to be talking to book groups along the way, like once your tour is over? And if so, how could people reach out to you? Because if their book group did want to call in and do a Skype chat with you, how would you be able to do that? And everybody, don't set them up while she's on tour. Look at her tour dates, please. Respect this. She has 2 young children too,
I do. The best way to contact me is on my website. My publicist is listed and my agent is listed. So
okay, great.
For book clubs, I would guess the publicist is probably better. And I have certainly done that in the past. I've Skyped with book groups. So yeah, I'd love it if
And
book
it'd be
groups.
fun to hear what groups are taking away from the book. I would love. I'm very, very anxious to hear that.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that I'm in 2 book clubs. I'm hoping somebody picks this book because I would love to sit there and have a real meaty discussion with people about it. Because when it's kind of book, when you close it, the first thing that happens when you're reading advanced reading copy is no one else has read it, and it's really a bummer because I'm like, wait a second, I really want to talk about this book. This is something I really want to be seeing.
Too.
Yeah, it's like. Not surprising, your writing is super cinematic, and it's already been picked up by Amy Pascal and Neil Moritz, and you're slated to write the adaptation, did I say?
Yeah.
So have you done screenwriting before?
For my book Heft, I did a screen adaptation, and that book was optioned and sort of like it's floating around in Hollywood someplace, and we'll see what happens.
Which is what happens. What people don't understand is it floats for a while. It's like I'm optioned. I mean, here's a funny story. Years ago, I was at a thrower conference, and this guy says, "I've got this book coming out soon." And he says, and it's already been optioned for Showtime. And I'm like, like this. It was Dexter.
Oh, wow.
It was just
sometimes it works.
And I'm sitting there like, later on, I just sat there going, that guy I met, he wasn't joking around. It actually did get made. But it's a long process.
You're right that it's a long process. Yeah. But it's underway.
Have you started writing at this point?
I have. But what form it will take is still up for debate.
Okay.
And I don't think I'm supposed to say more than that.
Then you don't need to say more than that.
But it's underway. Yeah, I feel like it has a good shot.
Well, and there's so many different ways something can go at this point. It can become a television show. It can become a limited series.
Right.
It can become a feature film. It's all, something different along the way at this point. So your books are typically published 4 years apart. In fact, it's quite funny because you said there's 2012, 2016. I think it was 8, 12, 16, and now 20 for your books. Yeah. Do you have anything percolating for the next book, or?
I do, yeah. I like many authors, I never really talk about my work in progress, but I've got something underway. I just have to figure out what it wants to be, and if it'll be something similar to this book that is categorized as an actual suspense novel, or if it'll be more like my other work, which was not. But I have to say, my first book was short stories, but my second 2 both had mysteries in them.
There was some lines underneath it.
Yeah, they weren't like mysteries with a capital M, but all of the characters, there was a puzzle to solve, and the characters were solving it. So I think I've always written in that way, but this is the first time I've written about a police officer doing that, and therefore it's easy to kind of categorize. Yeah,
and you had a balance as a police officer, but she was also such strong as the sister. I just saw her so strong as that at the same time.
Right.
So I wasn't pigeonholing her completely as a police officer because I felt like every time she was looking at herself as being part of the law, she was also putting herself as a mother. She was putting herself as a sister, a daughter, a relative, or just somebody nurturing of these people on the street, of what am I actually going to do? What's my role going to be in this situation?
Right.
So
yeah.
This has been so much fun. I can't wait to see what happens with the book from here.
Thank you.
And I am very, very interested to hear what our readers think about it as well. I hope you write and share about it. And really, go out and get a copy now. I think this is going to be a book a lot of people are going to be talking about. Thanks for joining us, and until next time.